Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History. I'm Larry Schweikart, co-author of Patriot's History of the United States with Michael Allen. We've been reading through Patriot's History. As always, we are in the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an earlier edition, the headers should work out fine, even if the page numbers are off a little bit. But if you go back too far, say the 10th edition, before the 10th edition, probably even some of the headers aren't going to be the same. But I'm sure you can figure it out through the index as to where we are. So we are in chapter 5, Small Republic, Big Shoulders, and we're about to start the section on Alexander Hamilton. Now, just a couple of housekeeping details. First, I had seriously, honestly planned to get the revision, what would essentially be the 20th anniversary revision out by the end of this summer. And it's more or less done. But a couple of things. I have a really, really big and I think important book that I need to go over still on Indians, on Native Americans throughout our whole history. It's the latest research, and I want to make sure we get this right. So I'm going to have to take some time and go through that and update that if it needs updating. Second of all, I've sent this out to a couple of friends, editors, to take a look at it and make sure I'm not repeating myself too much. And that's going to probably be another month before they get it in. In other words, by the time this is ready, I think you're going to be too far along in your curriculum for it to change much this year. You'll have your schedule set, your plan set. You won't have allowed an extra week to 3 weeks maybe to do this. I don't know. So I'm not going to kill myself to get this out this year. I'm thinking it'll probably come out in the spring, just as we start the convention schedule. So that's my thinking so far. Second, I have a new book coming out in the spring called The Patriot's History of Globalism, Its Rise and Decline. And I need to take a week to finish this book. I've got about 60% of it done, and I can write really fast, as you know. But I'm having trouble focusing enough to really get this knocked out when I have to do the podcasts, my political podcast at Wild World of Politics, and my Today's News. So starting next Monday for a full week, I'm taking off. You call it a vacation, call it a sabbatical. You can get by without me for a week. So we'll see where we end up by Friday, but then I'm going to take a week off. All right, let's get started. We are on page 143 with Hamilton's 3 reports. Congress spent the first 2 years of Washington's administration launching the federal ship and attending to numerous problems inherent in a new government. James Madison's first order of business had been to draft a Bill of Rights, move it through both houses of Congress, and send it on to the states, which had ratified all of the first 10 amendments by 1791. So I think you could say the Bill of Rights is pretty popular. Another weighty matter involved the creation of the federal judiciary. Congress's Judiciary Act of 1789 created 13 federal district courts, one for each state of the Union, 3 circuit courts of appeal, and a Supreme Court named by 6 justices. John Jay became the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He and each of his 5 colleagues rode the circuit several weeks of the year, providing the system with geographic balance. The remarkable feature of the plan was the latitude Congress enjoyed in setting the number of federal justices' courts and varied details of the operations of the federal court system. This has come under controversy in recent weeks, as there have been claims that Congress can legislate the court, regulate the court, whatever, not according to the Constitution. The Constitution allowed Congress to create, but not to dissolve any courts, anytime, anywhere. It's interesting. Second of all, while they set the minimum number of judges at 5, they didn't set a maximum number. This came up in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, where he tried to pack the court. And even then, a Democrat Congress slapped him down for it. They said, no way you're getting away with that. The only other power Congress has over the courts, well, two powers actually, one which they never use for anything, which is to defund them. You can just pass bills that have no funding for the judiciary system at all. And presumably judges who aren't getting paid, court clerks, no, I'm not drunk, court clerks who aren't getting paid, staff who aren't getting paid would quit. And in that way, theoretically, Congress could defund the court system and make it null and void. I suppose that's a possibility. I can't ever imagine that happening. But then again, I couldn't imagine that some idiots would actually go out and impeach a president twice over nothing just because they didn't like it. So who knows? But the only other power Congress has over the courts is that they may impeach and remove judges. That's it. There's no other way the Congress or the president has of disciplining, regulating, controlling judges. They are appointed for life, and that's it. So that's why the judges you pick, as President Trump did, are so supremely important. They're going to be there a long time. I think probably, I don't have a lot of fears. I try not to ever have a fear. Timothy says we're not given the spirit of fear, but a power and of love and of a sound mind. So I try not to have any fears. But my only fear or concern is that Clarence Thomas is pretty old, and that something health-wise could happen to him, or he could just say, hey, enough of this. I want to retire and ride around the country in my RV, which is what he does. He and his wife go around the country in their RV. And that would mean that the current, I think, illegal occupant of the White House would then be able to pick the next Supreme Court justice. And given the way the Senate is stacked, I'm pretty sure that whomever he picked would be confirmed. But then by the same token, a couple of the other justices aren't in the best of health. I think Sotomayor is a diabetic. I could be wrong. I think she's had some real issues with diabetes. So who knows? I mean, you never know. Scalia died at a somewhat early age. But anyway, back to my point. This discussion that Congress can regulate the court is insane, totally ungrounded in history. There is no precedent. And outside of adding new judges, adding additional courts, impeaching or defunding, Congress is out of the picture when it comes to the courts, and only the president can nominate, and the Senate has to confirm judges. Those are the only constitutional powers regarding the courts. Okay. Page 144. Those issues, while of great importance, nevertheless took a backseat to the overriding economic issues that had, after all, sparked the creation of the new republic in the first place. Few people in American history have been so perfectly suited to an administrative post as Alexander Hamilton was in his position of Treasury Secretary. Governor Morris once observed that a Hamilton speech was, quote, praised by everybody but supported by none. Hamilton had written his essays for the Federalist Papers essentially from his own knowledge of history and philosophy, plumbing, quote, the timeless principles behind contemporary events, unquote. As with so many of the founders, Hamilton soundly distrusted people. His early deep Christianity, which had waned as he aged, only to return at the end of his short life, taught him that sinful man would usually act on his basest instincts. As Ron Chernow, his biographer, put it, Hamilton was, quote, faith in Americans never quite matched his faith in America itself. Hold on a second. I actually found an error here while I was reading this to you. The line should read, as Ron Chernow, his biographer, put it, Hamilton's faith in Americans never quite matched his faith in America itself. There should be no was in there, which we'll take care of in the next printing, which we can do. Yet to invest his life in the nation implied something more fundamental about Hamilton's views, namely a reflection of an inner belief in America's providential history, that God can surmount the failings of individuals to produce greatness. There was a great seminal article by Cecilia Kenyon called Alexander Hamilton, Rousseau of the Right. And her point was that Hamilton liked the people as a whole, but he didn't like individuals. And so what this caused him to do was enact policies or programs that were distrustful of a movement of the masses, what we would call popular democracy, which is why we have a republic and not a democracy, is because the founders, all except Jefferson, were very concerned about mobocracy. Okay. Hamilton's plans took the form of 3 reports delivered to Congress in 1790-91 that laid the problems before the lawmakers and forced them to give legal weight to his fiscal inclinations. His first paper, quote, the Report on the Public Credit, January 1790, tackled the nation's debt problem. At the end of the Revolution, the national government owed more than $70 million in bond holders. Now, at that time, that was a lot of, that's the trillions today. That's a lot of money in the 1790s. On top of that, some, not all states, owed monies amounting collectively to an additional $25 million. Then there was a third layer of $7 million that existed on top of that from various IOUs issued by Washington and other generals on behalf of the Continental Congress. Literally, Washington, if he needed a horse or an ox or food or powder or whatever, he would just take it and write an IOU to the farmer and say, hey, get back with us after the war. Napoleon didn't even offer the IOUs, he just took it. American speculators held 75% of this combined $102 million debt. Most of them had paid approximately 15 cents on the dollar for the national and state bonds at a time when many doubted their worth. In other words, while speculators get a bad name, these guys were willing to risk money on America's future. And you say, well, they're just trying to get rich. Well, maybe, but they were willing to risk money when nobody else was. So, you know, it's worth paying them off. Hamilton's problem was how to pay off the bondholders and simultaneously refinance the nation's many upcoming expenses in order to establish a sound fiscal policy and a good credit rating. It was an ironic situation in that the United States, which sprang from the stock of England, whose credit rating was the model of all the world, had to pull itself out of the pit of bankruptcy. Hamilton called his proposal assumption, meaning the U.S. government would assume the debts. First, the national government would assume all the remaining state debts, regardless of the inequities between states, and combine them with the national debt and any legally valid IOUs to individuals. Then the federal government would pay off that debt at face value, 100 cents on the dollar, a point that caused an immediate firestorm among those who had complained that the debt should be paid to the original holders of the instruments. Well, that's a problem. Those holders sold the debts because they didn't have faith in the country. Of course, there's no proving who had originally held anything. And the idea flew in the face of Anglo-American tradition that possession is 9/10 of the law. Originally, Hamilton intended to tax the states to fund the payments, hence the source of the confusing 3/5 compromise for taxation. But this never occurred because of the success of Hamilton's other proposals. So in a way, Hamilton ended up funding the slaveocracy. All right, follow me on this. The 3/5 compromise that said that a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a free person's vote, or 3/5 of all slaves would be counted toward population for voting, was to be offset. That was going to give the South more representatives, right? That was to be offset by a penalty, which was a tax that would also tax 3 out of 5 slaves that the states would have to pay. Except because Hamilton's program proved so successful, they never got around to imposing that 3/5 tax, national tax on the states. We ended up raising all of our money from tariffs and land sales, and thus, in high irony, Alexander Hamilton, who certainly was no friend of slaves, or no friend of slave owners, ended up setting up a system that benefited the slave owners for quite a while, because it took away the only penalty in the Constitution for owning slaves. Follow me? Okay. Equally controversial, however, was the plan Hamilton submitted for paying the debts. He wanted the federal government to issue new bonds to borrow more money at better terms, like refinancing your house at a lower mortgage rate, creating a permanent national debt to help finance the government's operations. Hamilton's aims were clear. He wanted to establish confidence in and good credit for the new government among creditors at home and abroad, and thus ally creditors with the new government, ensuring its success. As he noted, quote, "The only plan that can preserve the currency is one that will make it the immediate interest of the moneyed men to cooperate with the government." So here's the dilemma. You got to have the bankers, folks. I know we all hate bankers, right? Got to have the banks, got to have the bankers, and you got to have the bankers on your side. If you're a country, you got to have them invested in your country, wanting to see your country succeed. But you can't allow the bankers to have so much investment in your country that they dictate policy, or that they can lobby, which is where we are today. We have a disproportionate weight of big financials like BlackRock and Citibank and Vanguard and groups like this, who disproportionately weigh policy toward things that the majority of Americans don't want. So it's a dilemma. It's not easily fixed. Believe me, nobody has the answer to this. Hamilton's aims were clear. He would establish confidence in good credit for a new government among creditors at home and abroad. As he noted, the only plan that can preserve the currency is one which will make it in the immediate interest of the moneyed men to cooperate with the government. A national debt, he said, quote, he wrote in a sentence that thoroughly shocked old Whigs, "if not excessive, is a national blessing." That's emphasis ours. The secretary had no intention to form a debt peonage, but fully understood that monetary growth fueled investment and economic expansion. In that sense, he departed from the mercantilists and joined arms with a new capitalist, Adam Smith. So there's a book out there favorably called Hamilton's Blessing, talking about the debt. No, that wasn't how Hamilton looked at it. He looked at it as, how many of you own a business? Do you have a line of credit? Almost everybody does. Why? Because you need a ready access to, when your revenue flows are down, you need to be able to get money to pay your employees and so forth, and then you try to stash it away when business is good. But you always need a form of credit out there. Lines of credit are the way businesses operate. Got a friend has a much bigger business than mine. He's got, I don't know, $1 million line of credit. Big companies have $50, $60 million lines of credit, right? So Hamilton wanted to establish a way the United States of America could have a line of credit. He did not believe in permanent debt. I'll show you why in just a minute. Contrary to traditional portrayals, Hamilton and Jefferson shared much ground on these issues. Jefferson, in an off-cited letter of September 1789, had stated that, quote, "the earth belongs to the living, Or in other words, those alive at any given time should not be saddled with the debts and obligations of earlier generations. Defining a generation as 19 years, Jefferson sought to restrain the government from following the destructive French model and creating a debt so high the state would collapse. Yet Hamilton's plan called for a Jeffersonian structure through a sinking fund that would require legislation to always pay off old debt legally before being allowed to issue new bonds. Or in modern terms, it was an American Express form of credit whereby the balance had to be paid off every month, not just the interest on the debt, sort of a MasterCard line of credit, which was what he also feared. So whereas Jefferson wanted to put a generational time limit on the nation's debts, Hamilton preferred a functional limit. You don't get new debt till you can pay off the old debt, which is pretty good reasoning. Both boiled the debt issue down to the political dangers it presented, but there they came to radically different conclusions. Where Jefferson hated the notion of tying the wealthy to government because he thought it would put the bankers in power, Hamilton embraced it for the same reason. If the nation owed financiers a great deal of money, they were in the weaker position, not government. This is the old, if you owe the bank $100, you've got a problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank has a problem, right? There are times at which the banks cannot afford to let the nation fail. And there are times, as we have seen, where the nation can't, or at least thinks it can't, allow the banks to fail. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship. I know many of you don't like that, but it's reality. And by the way, the United States is the only nation on earth that has the kind of banking structure we have, which is made up of tens of thousands of small local unit banks. Bank of England has one bank with branches, okay? Bank of France, one bank with branches. There's a few private banks, but not many. But here we have thousands and thousands of these little banks. You probably could name 3 or 4 in your town alone, okay? The reason these came about was because of American localism and populism. We are a localist, populist, federalist country. We tend to try to devolve power down to its lowest level, and that includes financial power. So we have all these local banks, right? Good. You know the local banker. Yeah, they might give you a loan when otherwise they might think, and that's not a very good risk, but I know Joe and he's good for it. That kind of thing. The flip side is when there's financial distress, guess who goes out of business? All these local banks. It's the old Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life thing, right? So I strongly recommend, if you're really into this, there's a book by my friend, former vice chairman of the comptroller of the currency, professor of finance at Columbia University, Charles Calomiris, C-A-L-O-M-I-R-I-S. He's not in this edition of the book, or not much. He's in the updated edition. And he has a book called Fragile by Design. Fragile by Design. And it's really a look at America's banking structure from the beginning. And he makes this exact point, that it was the nature of us having these thousands of local banks that made US banking history far more unstable than anywhere else in the world. Realize that we're down there with Argentina in terms of number of bank crises. We had one in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, 1929-30, 1987, 2007 and 8. And we have them largely because of this structure where we have a Federal Reserve, which is a private, 4/5 private bank overseeing member banks, but all banks are not member banks. Thousands and thousands of small banks are not members of the Federal Reserve. And so when instability hits, they're the first ones to go. And in the 1930s, literally thousands were wiped out in a year by their small capitalization. Some of these banks only have $5,000 at the time, only had $5,000 capitalization. Okay. Hamilton's desire to rally creditors and bankers to support the new federal government was also apparent in his second paper, Report on the National Bank, December 1790. This plan voiced Hamilton's desire for a national fiscal agency, a Bank of the United States, modeled after the Bank of England. This Bank of the United States, or BUS, would safeguard all federal tax and land sales revenues, transact government financial affairs, meet government payroll, and issue and circulate currency, thereby regulating smaller banks. To Hamilton, all these missions were subordinated to the bank's role as a steady source of credit to the national government. Remember, all, repeat after me, all national banks in the world exist for one reason only: to lend the government money. So the Bank of France exists, Bank of Russia exists, Bank of England exists, Bank of Turkey exists. Wherever you go, the national bank exists to lend the government money. It did not disturb Hamilton, though, that with 80% of its stock held by private investors, the BUS would provide its owners with access to public funds for their private speculative ventures. It is essential to understand that contrary to practices today, insider trading and insider investing were among the primary purposes of starting a bank. You started a bank so that you would have access to your knowledge about business conditions and could lend accordingly. It was not at all illegal at that time. Virtually everyone understood that in order to marshal a community's or nation's finances around important projects, the primary owners of banks had to have legitimate access to those large pools of capital. Hamilton's bank plan thus aimed to bring sound fiscal practices and a strong currency to the government through an alliance lucrative to private bankers and the investor class at large. At this point, it's worthwhile to reiterate that contrary to populist image, Hamilton had no illusions about the dangers inherent in big government. He rightly understood that over the long term, prices did not lie. Monetary values reflect real value in short order. While the will of the people might swing wildly depending on emotions, news coverage, or propaganda, or other factors, markets generally are constrained by reality, and he wanted to let that reality enforce its discipline on the American finances. It worked. When Hamilton's plan took effect in 1791, U.S. debt per capita in real dollars stood at $197, as each family on average owed $197 worth of national debt. Within 20 years, it had plummeted to just $49. I think today we're at several $1,000s per family. This was due both to Hamilton's brilliant structure and Jefferson's commitment to eliminate the debt. But Hamilton's system met an immediate test when the New York businessman William Duer, who speculated in bonds, bought on a financial panic in New York City in 1792. Instead of bailing out Duer, Hamilton allowed him to fail, then behind the scenes assured the Bank of New York that he would not allow it to collapse. Duer went to debtor's prison, but Hamilton, at a high penalty rate, loaned money to private sector through the Bank of the United States, minimized moral hazard while stifling runs, and the panic ended quickly. Hamilton described the effects as, quote, pernicious and as, quote, disgusting all sober citizens and giving a wild air to everything. Just a word. Bank panics are almost always caused by plain old fear. Something happens to something in the system. And because of the nature of all, repeat after me, all banking, everywhere, at all times, is engaged in fractional reserve banking. What does that mean? It means that banks keep only a small portion of the money that they theoretically owe in forms of dollars that are circulating out there. They only keep a small portion in their vault. And if there is a run in which people come in and demand those dollars to withdraw them, or in the earlier age, if they come in with paper money and demand it be converted into gold or silver, the bank can't meet that. The trick is to reassure everybody that the bank has enough assets to, over time, meet all that, which they almost always do. Yeah, there's insolvent banks. But most of the time, a healthy bank will have plenty of assets to meet its demands, just not right now. If it knows the demand is coming, say in a month, it will make sure those assets are available. So in all runs, the trick to break the run is to convince people that the bank has their money and that it's safe. A.P. Giannini, who founded the Bank of Italy, did this in the Great San Francisco earthquake in the early 1900s. No bank could get their gold out of the vaults because the vaults were too hot. But Giannini was able to get his gold out. And he lived in San Mateo, outside of San Francisco, and he was a produce, in addition to being a banker, he was a produce grocer, had a big produce business before he went into banking. And so he brought a buckboard into San Francisco and he was able to get his gold out and he stashed it in this buckboard and then covered it over with fruits and vegetables and very nonchalantly drove it out of San Francisco. He's probably driving millions of dollars out of San Francisco while people were looting. He came back the next day with all that gold, set up 2 barrels and a plank, and a sign that said Bank of Italy, open to loan. He was ready to lend people money because he knew people would be panicked because they couldn't get their money out. Guess what happened? At the end of the day, Giannini had taken in more in deposits than he loaned out in money. He broke the run himself. Another story, great bank run of the 1930s. There's a bank in Salt Lake City. I'm sorry, the name escapes me now. It was run by Mariner Eccles and his brother. And when the run started, the big bank runs, they held a quick meeting. They said, we're not going to have enough money to meet all the demand here. And so Eccles told his staff, his tellers, okay, I want you to be very polite, pay out to everybody, but do it as slowly as you can. Count the money twice every time. Stall, stall, stall. And they did. That night, Eccles was able to get a supply of cash from the Federal Reserve Bank. I don't know if that would be the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, probably. So he had a shipment come in overnight of money. And they came in before the bank opened, put the money in all the drawers. They made it through the first night. And he said, now we're going to change tactics. Now, when people come in, don't let a line form. Whatever you do, pay the money out as quickly as you can. Don't let a line form. You know what? By noon, the panic was over. Everybody saw that anybody who went into the bank could get their money. There wasn't any concern, and people stopped asking for their money. So it's all about confidence. All right. We will pick up here Friday, and we will probably get through this section on Hamilton, maybe the next small section, and then we'll take our week break. So let me remind you 2 things. First of all, on the Wild World of History, we have something called a VIP. Folks, this is a tremendous resource. If you haven't been subscribing to the VIP, it's $6 a month, $69 a year. And I've got 5 ongoing video lesson programs. The latest one is Integrity, Winston Churchill. I've got Reagan, the American president. I just added a new unit for him. I've got the 1620 default, 11 or 12 lessons, video lessons as to why the 1619 project is full of hooey. The Horrible History of Howard Zinn, Enduring Lessons on Life and Citizenship. I have a free ebook for you, All Thumbs, How Our Obsession with Cell Phones is Damaging Our Kids. And you get 2 full years worth of Wild Wednesday night webcasts. So that's going to be 100, more or less about 100 Wednesday webcasts, each one on a different historical topic, from Napoleon to the charge of the Winged Hussars, to was Prohibition popular, to Hitler, whatever. This is great stuff. Each podcast, I've used maps, images, quotations, research drawn from the time. They're about 45 minutes long. So that's something else you get as part of the VIP. Believe me, this is a real value at $6 a month or $69 a year. Just sign up for the VIP at the site. Remember, we're trying to turn Patriots history into a video. I've had good success, but I still need your help. I need a lot more help, but we're doing good. And watch the trailer on the site. And if you like it, buy me a coffee, $5. Buy me a coffee. We'll get this sucker made. And then if you're into politics and you want more political commentary, go to the wild world of politics. And there I have the Insider. It's kind of the political side of VIP. And the Insider contains a numerous group of lessons, including one not available in the VIP called Globalism, Its Rise and Decline. We already have 5 lessons of video there, plus 4 other ongoing lessons, including Reagan, which you get in the VIP section. Sort of like Disneyland, Disney World, different rides at different parks. But this one is focused on politics, and it gives you access to Larry's commentary, which I have Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 o'clock, from 15 to 20 minutes on the most recent political news and stories of the day. So you want to check that out too. All right, I'll see you Friday, and then we'll take a break for a week.